May 1945. The war in Europe was collapsing in on itself. The once mighty Third Reich now lay in ruins. Its cities burned out, and its leadership scattered. Amid the chaos, a small detachment from the US 101st Airborne Division, known as the Screaming Eagles, moved through the Bavarian Alps toward a place few Allied soldiers had ever seen. The Berghof, Adolf Hitler's mountain retreat near Berchtesgaden. What they found inside was not just the remnants of a dictator's private world, but traces of a woman who had lived her entire life in his shadow. The Berghof was already smoldering when the Americans arrived. The Luftwaffe had bombed the area weeks earlier, and retreating SS troops had tried to destroy what was left. Yet among the debris, soldiers discovered fragments of furniture, scattered photographs, and charred correspondence bearing the initials EB. One officer, Lieutenant Robert K. Stafford, recalled in a later interview that the smell of burnt paper and perfume lingered in the air, like someone had tried to erase a life. Inside what had been Eva Braun's dressing room, beneath a collapsed beam, they uncovered a small metal case, heat-warped but intact. Within it lay letters, many still legible, written in careful cursive on cream stationery embossed with a golden eagle and swastika. Each letter was addressed to Mein Liebster, my dearest, and dated between 1936 and 1945. Some spoke of quiet evenings at the Berghof, of picnics by the Königssee, of her longing for a life beyond the confines of Hitler's circle. Others grew darker, especially as the war turned against Germany. He no longer smiles, one passage reportedly read. The world weighs upon his shoulders, and yet I cannot reach him. I am a ghost beside him. It was the voice of a woman both intimate and invisible, one who had witnessed history from its most dangerous. Proximity. Military intelligence officers from the 101st Airborne's G2 section immediately took possession of the find. According to the unit log dated May 8, 1945, the same day Germany officially surrendered, the Braun correspondence was sealed and transferred to the US Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, in Salzburg for processing. The discovery promised unprecedented insight into Hitler's private life, perhaps even his final mental state. Yet, within weeks, the documents vanished from official record. The immediate aftermath of war in Bavaria was a fog of competing claims. British and American units often overlapped in their search for Nazi archives, art, and personal effects. The US had Operation Paperclip and the Monument's Men, the British, their own secret war records divisions under MI6 and Chef Intelligence. The Braun letters fell somewhere in between, too personal for the archives, too revealing for propaganda, and too politically sensitive to release. A May 18, 1945, dispatch from the 101st's headquarters mentioned a box of female correspondence of no operational value, a phrase historians now interpret as deliberate. Understatement. What remains certain is that the letters never made it into any public collection. The US Army's Historical Division has no record of them. The National Archives in College Park lists only a single entry. Private writings seized near Berchtesgaden, unverified source. With a classification note dated 1946, some historians believe they were shipped to Washington and later misplaced amid millions of captured German documents. Others suggest they were quietly destroyed. For the soldiers who stumbled upon the letters, the moment carried little of the intrigue it holds today. They were tired, hungry, and eager to return home. Most had seen enough horror to last a lifetime. Yet in those burned-out rooms, among the ruins of Hitler's sanctuary, they could feel the ghost of the regime still lingering. Private Thomas Heller, then 21, wrote in his journal, "It was like walking into the mind of madness, but the woman's touch was everywhere. Perfume bottles, silk dresses, a photograph of her and him smiling by the lake. It felt human and monstrous all at once." As night fell over the Alps, the soldiers left the Berghof behind, unaware they had carried out one of the last recoveries of the European war. Within a week, the area would be occupied by French forces, and most remaining structures looted or demolished. The burned estate faded into legend, and with it, the memory of a box of letters that might have changed our understanding of Hitler's final years. In the decades that followed, fragments of rumor persisted, stories told in veterans' reunions, whispered among archivists. Some claimed the letters contained confessions of despair, others subtle references to secret negotiations or hidden retreats. But without the originals, truth dissolved into speculation. What was certain was that Eva Braun's voice, once buried beneath her lover's shadow, had been momentarily uncovered, only to disappear again. Somewhere between the mountains of Bavaria and the archives of Salzburg, the trail went cold. No official retrieval record, no receipt of transfer, no trace in the declassified OSS reports that poured out after 1945. The letters existed, and then they didn't. And that absence, the silence in the official files, became its own mystery. The war had ended. The Reich had fallen. Yet the personal story of the woman behind Hitler, the one who saw the man, not the myth, remained sealed in secrecy. The question lingered like smoke over the ruins. What did Eva Braun write in those final letters? And why did they have to disappear? Autumn 1945. Europe was in ruins, its governments rebuilding from ashes, while its intelligence agencies sifted through the debris of a dead empire. Among the fragments of the Third Reich's collapse were whispers of an extraordinary find: personal letters written by Eva Braun, Adolf Hitler's longtime companion. The US Army's Counterintelligence Corps had supposedly recovered them from the Berghof, but as reports reached Allied command, interest grew beyond curiosity. The letters weren't simply love notes. They might hold insight into Hitler's private thoughts, his paranoia, and his waning grip on power. At first, the letters were classified under the innocuous label Miscellaneous Private Correspondence, Female Source. But within weeks, word of their existence crossed the channel. MI6's Section 5, responsible for counterintelligence and psychological analysis of Axis leaders, took notice. British intelligence, still heavily invested in understanding Hitler's mind after his death, saw in Eva Braun's writings a potential key to his psyche, something that could validate or contradict the Allied Psychological Warfare Division's wartime assessment known as the Hitler Source Book. The struggle for access began quietly. In November 1945, a memorandum from Brigadier Charles Hambro, head of the Special Operations Executive's Residual Office, referenced private papers recovered by American forces near Berchtesgaden, content believed to include domestic correspondence from the Führer's inner circle. He advised discreet acquisition through liaison channels. That phrase, discreet acquisition, was code for clandestine retrieval. For MI6, it was not about stealing secrets, but preserving political advantage in a world already shifting toward Cold War rivalries. While London pressed for cooperation, American officers in Salzburg grew uneasy. Lieutenant Colonel James O. Richards, overseeing document transfers to the OSS successor, the Strategic Services Unit, wrote in a private memo, "These are not state papers, but they are sensitive. The subject is the Führer's mistress, and her words could undermine post-war policy if sensationalized." His concern reflected a deeper anxiety within the American intelligence establishment, that publishing Braun's letters might humanize Hitler, turning him from a symbol of evil into a tragic, emotional figure. Yet curiosity persisted. Some of the recovered letters reportedly contained subtle criticisms of Nazi policies. In one fragment, later cited in a 1952 declassified summary, Eva Braun wrote, "He speaks of destiny, yet destiny no longer believes in him. I wonder if faith is a weapon or a lie." For historians, that single line suggested that Braun saw the collapse long before it came. For intelligence officers, it raised troubling implications. Had she influenced any of Hitler's final decisions, or did her words merely reflect a lover's despair in isolation? The Americans, wary of British intrusion, transferred the cash to an SSU field office in London under temporary custody. But British intelligence was not content to wait. Records from the British National Archives indicate that in early 1946, MI6 dispatched agents to discreetly question surviving members of Braun's household, including her sister Gretel Braun-Fegelein. Held briefly in Munich by the US Army, Gretel confirmed the existence of many personal notes and journals destroyed in April 1945, but she added cryptically, "Not all burned, some were taken." That testimony only deepened the transatlantic tension. By mid-1946, the Americans had begun digitizing key Nazi documents onto microfilm for shipment to Washington under Operation Dustbin, but the Braun letters were not among them. Instead, they were rerouted to an intelligence archive in Camp King, near Frankfurt, where interrogation of former SS officers took place. There, according to surviving logs, analysts from both the US Army and British liaison units reviewed and debated their authenticity. Some claimed the handwriting matched Braun's known samples. Others suspected forgeries planted by opportunists seeking favor with the victors. The psychological profile divisions saw a rare opportunity. In one classified report dated August 9, 1946, a British analyst wrote, "These writings, if genuine, depict a woman torn between adoration and fear, vanity and guilt. She reveals a domestic world at odds with the fanaticism of the Reich. It is dangerous material because it makes monsters human." That observation would echo through the next several decades of suppressed research on Nazi leadership. Amid growing bureaucratic rivalry, the physical letters themselves became a liability. Rumors spread of journalists and art dealers offering bribes to see them. To prevent leaks, they were reclassified as cultural materials, private origin, and slated for secure transfer to London's War Office vaults. But before that could happen, the box and its accompanying catalogue entry simply vanished from the Salzburg Manifest. No one claimed responsibility. British intelligence accused American mishandling. The US claimed it was lost in transit. Some within the OSS successor agency quietly suggested deliberate concealment, perhaps even destruction, by officers fearful of scandal. After all, the war's victors were shaping a moral narrative, one that required clear villains and heroes. The letters, filled with domestic tenderness and despair, blurred those lines. The power struggle between US and British agencies over a dead dictator's private papers might seem petty now, but it reflected the dawn of a new intelligence age, one built not on open archives, but on secrets and control. Those who read fragments of Eva Braun's words saw something unsettling. Not ideology, but humanity. And in the ruins of the Reich, humanity was more dangerous than any classified weapon. As 1946 drew to a close, the trail grew colder. The OSS dissolved, MI6 turned its gaze toward Moscow, and the letters, real or imagined, slipped into the fog of post-war secrecy. Yet their existence, whispered among archivists and veterans, refused to fade. Somewhere, locked in a nameless box, was the voice of a woman history had chosen to forget. And as one MI6 officer later wrote in his journal, "Perhaps that was the true danger. Not what the letters said, but what they might have forced us to feel." Winter, 1946. Europe's landscape of ruins had begun to settle into uneasy silence. The guns had stopped, but the secrets left behind by war still stirred in basements, bunkers, and archives. Deep within the administrative maze of Allied intelligence, a single name flickered through the paperwork of two nations. Braun, Eva, personal correspondence, recovered May 1945. It was a small entry in a shipping manifest that connected Salzburg to London. But after that, nothing, just absence. The man last known to handle the file was an American archivist named Edward Lane, attached to the Strategic Services Unit, the post-war successor to the OSS. Lane was a quiet, meticulous officer from Boston, respected for his precision and discretion. His assignment in early 1946 was simple: to catalogue captured Nazi documents for shipment to Washington. On January 11th, he boarded a military transport from Munich to London with 2 sealed crates marked "Cultural Materials, Private." Only 1 crate arrived. Lane vanished en route. His disappearance was first reported by the Office of Military Government, US, 3 days later, but it was quickly buried under routine paperwork. No official investigation followed. Missing personnel were not uncommon in the chaos of post-war Europe, but whispers circulated among his colleagues. Rumors that he had been carrying something valuable, something others wanted. A surviving MI6 memo dated February 1946 describes a loss of materials of psychological significance and potential compromise of Anglo-American understanding. To the British, the missing crate was more than an archival inconvenience. It was an opportunity to gain leverage in their quiet competition with American intelligence. To the Americans, it was an embarrassment that hinted at internal corruption or betrayal. In the following months, fragments of Braun's letters began to resurface, but not in archives. In Munich's shattered black market, amid the trade of stolen art and forged identity papers, scraps of fine stationery embossed with the Reich's eagle appeared for sale. A former SS adjutant reportedly offered a small bundle of letters to a French journalist, claiming they came from the Führer's mistress, found after the fall. The journalist, skeptical, turned them over to the Allied Control Council. Most were dismissed as forgeries, but two matched Eva Braun's verified handwriting. The contents were hauntingly mundane, reflections on loneliness, fear, and the illusion of loyalty. "He no longer looks at me," one read. "I am not real to him anymore, only an image of what he once desired." That tone, intimate, resigned, detached, suggested authenticity. Historians later speculated these fragments might have been carbon copies from Braun's personal typewriter, or drafts never meant to be sent. Still, no one could explain how they escaped Allied custody. The black market of post-war Germany was a world unto itself, where secrets were worth more than gold. Allied officers, former SS men, and civilians traded not just art or valuables, but information. Letters, files, names. Amid that murky commerce, Braun's correspondence became a whispered legend, a lost confession of the woman closest to Hitler. Some claimed the letters revealed her knowledge of the Führerbunker's final hours. Others said they hinted at a hidden Alpine refuge or unspoken crimes. None of it was proven, but the allure of what might be hidden within those pages drew intelligence agents, journalists and opportunists into dangerous waters. By 1947, the Americans had restructured their intelligence apparatus into the newly formed Central Intelligence Group, precursor to the CIA, and their focus had shifted toward the Soviet Union. In the bureaucratic shuffle, minor mysteries like Eva Braun's letters were deprioritized. Yet British intelligence, led by historian-turned-agent Hugh Trevor Roper, maintained a quiet interest. Trevor Roper, who had investigated Hitler's death, wrote in a confidential note, "If authentic, the Braun papers could shed light on the Führer's state of mind during the final months, a matter of immense historical and psychological value." But even he couldn't locate them. The remaining evidence was ephemeral, rumors, copies, and testimonies. One anonymous report claimed that Edward Lane had been seen in Hamburg weeks after his disappearance, working under an assumed name. Another said his body was found near the Dutch border, shot twice, his identification missing. None of these accounts were verified. Lane's family received no explanation, only a letter of regret for loss during overseas duty. Decades later, declassified CIA records would list the Braun letters among materials of undetermined disposition, alongside missing SS archives and untraced art shipments. But to those who had glimpsed even a fragment, the mystery was personal. It wasn't just about what Eva Braun might have written, it was about how easily truth could vanish in the machinery of victory. In the spring of 1947, Munich's black market burned to the ground after a mysterious explosion in a warehouse believed to hold confiscated Nazi materials. The fire destroyed thousands of pages, including the two verified Braun fragments. Only a single translation survived in British custody. Its final line read, "If history ever remembers me, let it not be as his shadow, but as someone who once loved and feared the same man." The words carried a weight that unsettled even hardened intelligence officers. In them, Eva Braun ceased to be a caricature, a shallow, complicit bystander, and became something more complex, a human being trapped in devotion to a monster. For post-war intelligence, that humanity was inconvenient. It didn't fit the moral narrative of the victors, and so, the trail of her letters, of Edward Lane, of the lost crate, of the black market fragments, faded into classified silence. But within the archives of both nations, her name lingered, redacted but never erased. It was a reminder that even in victory, some truths are too delicate to expose. The mystery of the missing letters had become something larger, a reflection of the New World Order itself. The war had ended, but secrecy, once a weapon of survival, had become a way of life. Somewhere between London and Washington, between truth and control, the voice of Eva Braun disappeared again. Spring, 1948. Europe was rebuilding, yet the scars of war were everywhere. Bombed-out cathedrals, displaced families, and archives full of secrets no one dared to read. Beneath the surface of recovery, another war was unfolding. An intelligence war fought not with guns, but with documents, silence, and control. In the ashes of Nuremberg's Grand Reckoning, historians and officers alike began to notice something troubling. Records were missing. Shipments of captured Nazi documents had vanished en route to American and British repositories. And among the gaps, one name reappeared, the mysterious Braun correspondence. The story began quietly, with a simple inquiry. In May 1948, an American historian attached to the Nuremberg Documentation Center, Dr. Harold Vance, requested access to personal papers seized from Berchtesgaden for his upcoming book on Hitler's final days. His request was denied without explanation. When he pressed further, an archivist whispered, "Those papers never arrived." Within weeks, Vance's research files were seized by military government authorities and his project abruptly cancelled. What he'd stumbled upon was not fiction, but the thin line between history and secrecy. The disappearance of Eva Braun's letters coincided with a wave of unexplained losses across the Allied archive system. Entire crates of SS personnel files, Gestapo interrogation reports, and private correspondences had been misplaced between Bavaria and Frankfurt. The US Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, blamed post-war chaos. British officials cited clerical mismanagement, but a few insiders suspected deliberate removal. As one internal memorandum from the US Army's Historical Division noted, certain materials, particularly those of intimate or psychological character, may be withheld to protect political sensitivities and moral authority. The letters, they said, were too human, too revealing. Eyewitnesses from Camp King, the former interrogation center near Frankfurt, offered chilling details. A German translator assigned to inventory personal effects in 1946 recalled seeing handwritten notes by a woman named Eva, describing long days of solitude and fear and how she felt she was being watched, even by the servants. The translator claimed the letters were tagged for destruction under non-essential cultural materials, yet later testimony suggested that an American file clerk, whose name was later redacted, made carbon copies before the originals were burned. That anonymous clerk, according to oral accounts, had been deeply disturbed by what he read. She wasn't writing to justify him, one recollection quoted him as saying years later. She was writing because she knew it was ending, and she wanted someone, anyone, to remember her as more than a shadow. Some of the copies allegedly survived, hidden in private trunks, or transferred quietly through the network of soldiers returning home. Meanwhile, at the Nuremberg trials, prosecutors continued their work, meticulously documenting the crimes of Nazi leaders, cross-referencing orders, memos, and diaries. Yet, in all the surviving documentation of Hitler's inner circle, Eva Braun's voice was conspicuously absent. Not one letter, not one diary page was entered into evidence. To historians, this absence felt calculated, almost strategic. She had lived for years at the heart of the regime, yet history had reduced her to a silent silhouette. British historian Hugh Trevor Roper, still investigating Hitler's last days, privately expressed frustration in a 1949 memorandum. Her silence is an archival silence, not a historical one. Someone decided she would not speak. In later decades, declassified intelligence reports would confirm his suspicion. Certain domestic documents had been deliberately excluded from post-war archives to maintain a consistent narrative of Nazi leadership's moral isolation. In simpler terms, no sympathy for the devils, but for intelligence officers, the motivation ran deeper. The early Cold War had begun, and the psychological image of Hitler, the unfeeling dictator, the embodiment of evil, had become a cornerstone of Western ideological warfare. Allowing Eva Braun's words, filled with doubt, affection, or despair, into the public domain risked muddying that image. Humanizing Hitler's household, even indirectly, could threaten the simplicity of post-war propaganda. Yet fragments kept surfacing. In 1951, an American collector anonymously donated several letters to the Library of Congress, claiming they were souvenirs from Berchtesgaden. The handwriting matched Braun's, and forensic testing confirmed the paper stock dated to the late 1930s. One letter read, "He dreams of victory, I dream of silence. Between us lies the sound of marching boots." It was signed simply, E. The letter was quietly reclassified and moved to a restricted collection, where it remained sealed for nearly 50 years. For those who had glimpsed the letters before they vanished again, the emotional weight was haunting. These weren't political documents. They were deeply personal reflections of a woman suffocating inside history's most dangerous relationship. In her words, the myth of the Führer fractured, revealing a man besieged by delusion and a woman consumed by the gravity of her proximity. By 1953, the last known trace of the Braun correspondence appeared in a shipping ledger from Frankfurt's document center, listing miscellaneous letters, personal, feminine origin, destroyed per directive. The reason? Low research value. But even that phrasing hinted at irony. The destruction of her words ensured she would forever remain a mystery. For historians, that absence became its own kind of evidence, a silence that spoke volumes. The post-war world had chosen which voices to remember and which to erase. Eva Braun, the woman who lived beside a tyrant yet left almost no mark, was among those erased for convenience. And yet, her story lingered, half remembered in footnotes, whispered in archives, and burned into the memories of those who once held her letters in their hands. As the 1950s dawned, the curtain closed on the last tangible traces of Eva Braun's voice. But the question refused to die. Were her letters truly destroyed, or simply hidden away, classified not to protect history, but to protect those who shaped it? The silence around her became deafening, and somewhere, in the vaults of Western intelligence, the shadow of a woman still waited to speak. The year was 1956. The world had entered a new era of tension. Berlin divided, Washington and Moscow locked in a contest of nerves. Yet in the archives and back offices of Western intelligence, another, quieter struggle continued: what to remember and what to forget. Among thousands of classified files marked non-operational, destroyed, or withheld for security reasons, the name Eva Braun still appeared, sometimes in fragments, sometimes in redacted lines, always elusive. Her missing letters had become more than an archival curiosity. They were now a symbol of everything the victors could not explain. For a handful of historians and intelligence officers, the Braun case had taken on a spectral presence. Each decade brought new rumors. An American colonel claiming to have seen the originals in a private collection in Virginia. A retired MI6 officer hinting that carbon copies were stored in a locked drawer at the War Office. None of these stories were verified, but the persistence of the whispers was telling. Something existed somewhere, and no one was willing to admit it. In Washington, the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency viewed such materials through a different lens. The early Cold War was as much a war of perception as of arms. Every document, every psychological profile had potential propaganda value. The CIA's Office of Research and Reports catalogued, captured German materials under behavioral and leadership studies. Most were harmless curiosities: Hitler's table talk, Goebbels' diaries, but Eva Braun's letters, should they ever reappear, posed a unique threat. They did not serve ideology. They exposed humanity. A confidential memorandum from 1958, now partially declassified, reads, "The Braun documents, if recovered, must remain restricted. Their content risks blurring established psychological constructs of the Führer and his entourage. Release would undermine pedagogical clarity and potentially elicit sympathy among residual extremist elements." In simpler terms, truth was dangerous when it humanized evil. Across the Atlantic, MI6 reached a similar conclusion. A 1961 internal review on sensitive domestic correspondences advised against public release, noting that materials of a personal or emotional nature, particularly those concerning Hitler's household, offer no benefit to state narratives. By then, the Cold War had fully crystallized into a moral contest, and moral clarity left no room for nuance. Eva Braun's words, if still in existence, were not merely inconvenient. They were subversive. Still, the story refused to die. By the mid-1960s, researchers in Germany began hearing of a Braun collection in private hands. An aging former officer of the US 101st Airborne, now living quietly in Oregon, hinted in an interview that he had kept a few pages from the Mountain House. When pressed, he refused to elaborate, saying only, "They weren't meant for the world. Not then, maybe not ever." Historians later identified him as Lieutenant Robert K. Stafford, the same man who had entered the ruins of the Berghof in 1945. Meanwhile, West German archivists began their own investigation. The newly formed Bundesarchiv, working with American and British partners, attempted to consolidate all known records from Berchtesgaden and Munich. Among the files recovered was a 1945 transfer note from the US Army Counterintelligence Corps listing private female correspondence of cultural interest. But the attached index sheet, where Eva Braun's name should have been, was torn away. The trail ended there. What troubled scholars most wasn't what was missing, but what was implied. If Braun's letters had truly been destroyed, why were there still active classification references in the archives of both nations as late as the 1970s? Why were those files routinely renewed under the label sensitive psychological content? The most likely explanation was also the most chilling. The letters still existed, locked within a vault, hidden under layers of bureaucratic invisibility. During the 1980s, as interest in personal histories of the Third Reich grew, journalists and documentarians once again tried to uncover the truth. BBC researchers were denied access to several British War Office collections, while the US National Archives released only heavily redacted summaries. One declassified page, stamped Declassified, 1987, mentioned a file called Subject, E. Braun, Personal Materials, Unverified Authenticity. The note at the bottom read, Location, unknown. The Cold War ended, but the secrecy did not. In the 1990s, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Germany opened thousands of Stasi files. None referenced Braun's letters. But one East German intelligence report speculated that Western agencies withhold personal documents of the Führer's household to maintain control of the Hitler narrative. Whether propaganda or insight, the statement echoed an uncomfortable truth, that history itself could be managed, edited, and restricted, just like intelligence. For the few who still sought the letters, the mystery had shifted from discovery to meaning. Why had they been hidden? Was it to shield the world from empathy, or to protect the victors from confronting the moral complexity of those they defeated? Eva Braun had lived in Hitler's shadow, but after the war, that shadow extended over her memory as well. In a 1998 symposium in Munich, historian Dr. Lotte Kuhn summarized the dilemma. If these letters exist, they are not merely artifacts. They are mirrors. They would show us how easily love can coexist with atrocity, how human emotion survives even within evil. That is why they frighten us. By the dawn of the 21st century, Eva Braun's missing letters had become one of World War II's quietest enigmas. Less a scandal than a haunting absence. The archives had grown thicker, the witnesses fewer, and the truth ever more elusive. But every few years, a file reference surfaced, a rumor reignited, and the question returned. What did she write, and who decided the world would never read it? In the silence of classified vaults and sealed rooms, the answer waited, buried not by time, but by choice. And somewhere between moral clarity and moral complexity, the untold letters of Eva Braun remained locked away, a human story that neither side wanted to face. Berlin, present day. 80 years have passed since the fall of the Reich, yet history's deepest shadows remain. In the vast archives of the US National Archives at College Park and Britain's Kew Gardens, millions of pages from the war years have been digitized, catalogued, and declassified. But among the scanned telegrams and command orders, the supposed Braun correspondence is still missing. Historians have combed through every manifest, every microfilm reel labeled captured German documents. Nothing. It is as if the letters never existed, yet too many traces suggest they did. For modern researchers, the mystery of Eva Braun's letters has evolved into a parable of secrecy itself. Theories abound. Some believe the letters were destroyed in 1948 during the reorganization of the Frankfurt Document Center. Others claim they were absorbed into CIA psychological archives, misfiled under false identities. A few insist they were quietly returned to Germany in the 1950s and hidden within private collections of former Nazi elites. But what unites every theory is a shared suspicion. The letters did not disappear by accident. Recent testimony adds to the intrigue. In 2017, a retired archivist from the US Army's Historical Division, who spoke under anonymity, revealed that, in the early 1960s, he handled a personal file labeled EB, sealed, no access code. He was instructed to transfer it to a diplomatic pouch bound for Washington. Inside, he glimpsed only a page. I cannot hate him as the world will. I can only mourn the man I thought he was. The phrase haunted him for decades, not for what it revealed, but for how human it sounded. To historians, such lines, if genuine, would transform how we perceive the psychological world within Hitler's inner circle. They would not exonerate, they would humanize. And perhaps that was precisely why they remained buried. The war's victors had built moral authority on clarity, good versus evil, liberation versus tyranny. To publish Eva Braun's intimate reflections, letters filled with doubt, dependence, and emotional confusion would blur those lines. In the fragile years after 1945, nuance was a threat. In Germany, renewed interest in the private lives of Nazi figures sparked quiet attempts to reopen the Braun file. Scholars at the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich have traced fragments of her handwriting to private estates once owned by SS officers who fled to South America. One such collection, acquired in 2019, contained personal photographs of Braun with handwritten captions. Summer 1942, Obersalzberg, and He laughed again today. No letters were included, but the find rekindled debate over whether the rest were still hidden abroad. The story now occupies a strange place between legend and truth, caught in the same twilight that shrouded so many wartime secrets. For documentarians and historians, the case is less about the words themselves than what they represent: the intersection of power, secrecy, and the human cost of control. Every government, every regime must decide which truths it allows to surface. In the case of Eva Braun, perhaps both the Allies and history itself chose silence. The emotional weight of that silence lingers. In documentaries and exhibitions, Braun is still depicted as the loyal consort, the shadow in the Führer's light, yet the few surviving lines attributed to her paint a more complex portrait. A woman isolated in luxury, confined by devotion, witnessing the collapse of everything she once believed in. We are all trapped, one supposed excerpt reads, not by walls, but by what we chose to ignore. Modern historians remain cautious. None of the rumoured fragments can be fully authenticated, and most are known only through third-hand accounts. Still, the pattern of suppression, vanished crates, redacted reports, misfiled transfers, suggests deliberate concealment. Even today, portions of the Allied intelligence archives remain sealed under national interest clauses that protect psychological profiles, propaganda studies, and materials of sensitive personal nature. If the Braun letters exist among them, they will likely remain hidden until the centennial of the war's end. And so the mystery endures. Were the letters destroyed to spare the public from empathy, to protect the victor's narrative, or perhaps to preserve the myth that monsters cannot love? The truth may be simple. Humanity itself was too uncomfortable a legacy to preserve intact. As the camera pans across the ruins of the Berghof today, its foundations overgrown with moss, its silence deeper than ever, the story comes full circle. The mountain that once echoed with Hitler's voice now hides only whispers of those who lived in his orbit. Somewhere between the flames of 1945 and the steel vaults of modern archives, the voice of Eva Braun was lost. But her absence still speaks. It tells us that history is not only written by the victors, it is edited by them. It reminds us that every classified file, every missing document, is a choice about what humanity is allowed to remember. And in that silence, the world continues to wonder what one woman, trapped in the shadow of absolute power, truly saw, and what she dared to write before the fire consumed it all. Because sometimes, the greatest secrets of war are not about the battles fought, but about the people who were never allowed to speak.